December. This year we're doing it on the Thursday after Thanksgiving.
The Thursday after Thanksgiving.
Isn't that the middle
The
of Hanukkah?
following week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't that the middle of Hanukkah already?
No.
It's early.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like single digits December.
The week of November, the last week after. I didn't know they had broken the share.
Oh, good.
No, I knew it was trouble.
We haven't sent out, we send out the email that says when you can sign up on November. November 1st. They'll sign it up. Yeah, Debbie C. Cantor sent it.
Is it because
Yes, we need rackers.
Yeah, because we didn't.
Sometimes Black Friday. Welcome. I'll make a few announcements before we get started. First of all, welcome everyone to our first Sunday brunch. I have a script here. Amy gave me a script. I'm just going to try and follow it. Welcome everyone to our first Sunday brunch series. We have several classes and programs that begin or occur over the next few weeks. So all the promotional materials are on the table. Please pick something up if you're all interested. If you have any questions, I'm sure Amy will be around at some point. You can ask her. Our next brunch will be Sunday, November 11th, and will be part of the Global Day of Jewish Learning. So this is how it's going to look. For the brunch section in the morning, Amy is going to be guiding us through a journey into the unknown, is the name of the program. And then after the brunch in the afternoon, there'll be two more study sessions. I'll be leading one, and Janice Rembo will be leading the other one. Take a look at the materials and the flyers. And if you have any questions, please see one of us. We'd be happy to talk to you about it. This is a worldwide program that goes on at the same time all over the Jewish world. It's not too early to register for our Scholar in Residence program. Dr. Jared Taney of UNC Wilmington will be with us for the weekend of November 30th through December 1st. Again, there are flyers on the table. He'll speak at a Shabbat dinner on November 30th, in services on December 1st, and at an evening program later that night. There's a charge for the Shabbat dinner program and the Saturday evening program. There's also a special gathering for sponsors of the weekend. If finances are an issue, please contact Amy. We don't turn people away. Again, brochures are on the table. All right. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Brad Johansson of WRAL News, who will be our moderator for today's forum. So let me just tell you a few things about Brad before I give him the microphone.
You're in trouble.
Brad Johansson is a 21-time Emmy Award winner and was an anchor and reporter in Cincinnati prior to arriving in Raleigh this spring. He has also worked in Las Vegas, Nevada, San Luis Obispo, California, Lansing, Michigan, and Peoria, Illinois. According to WRAL News Director Rich Gall, Brad, quote, understands the great opportunities, challenges, and responsibilities that come with the job. He believes in fair and balanced coverage of stories, regardless of personal beliefs, and in simplifying and clarifying news for the viewer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Brad.
Good morning. I'm not so sure. Do you need this?
Yes.
Is this good? You'd rather have this. You'd rather have this. All right, I'll do this. Thrilled to be with you. Just a little bit more about me. This is now, I'm entering month 7 here in North Carolina. And as one of the emails that came into me this week was, and you get lots of emails on the coverage. One was, I guess I'll have to give you a break because I see on your bio, you're from up north. So we'll have to give you a break here in the South. 26 years in Cincinnati for me. So in my 20s, this move would have been easy, but as an old man, this is a little bit of a change for me in moving here. I will be replacing David Crabtree, who is retiring at the end of December. So I don't really have a job yet. So I've been here for 7 months, kind of for the South to get used to the Northerner and the Northerner to get used to the Southerners. I'm thrilled to be here. As I told many this morning, there are very few stations in the country that are as wonderful as WRAL, which helped me make the move. My family is still in transition. So I am a father of 4, 2 are out, 2 left in. I got a sophomore in high school and a 5th grader. That's why I have to keep working for the rest of my life. My wife is a middle school math teacher, so I have a little education interest in what's going on here in North Carolina, because within the school system and the change with elementary and where you have to go in housing to get into a specific spot, they're back in Mason, Ohio for 1 more year, and Dad is living in a 1-bedroom apartment again at 56 years old. So this is a change for all of us. So we're commuting back and forth and doing this, but I'm thrilled to be here. I don't want to waste any more time with this. Let me introduce the candidates. Hopefully you've spoken to all of them. From our Senate District of 18, Mack, our Democratic candidate, and Brett Hessel, our Libertarian. John Alexander was unable to make it this morning, a Republican. From the 40th District in the House, Joe John, our Democrat, David Ulmer, Libertarian, and Marianne Avila. Marilyn Avila, as she says, she gets pronounced 3 different ways on the House floor. I'm used to that with Johansson. It doesn't always come out and slip off the tongue very easily. I want to begin. Deborah and the crowd wanted to make this a much more casual. So I'm going to, Mack, I'm going to start with you. We won't time it. Well, I'll get close, but we'll see if we can go 5 minutes with each of you. Marilyn said,
These are politicians.
So I will try and time it then. 5 minutes or below. Give us an idea of where you stand, what's important to you as you head into Election Day, why you're running, a little bit more about you, and then we will get into specific questions. But in the casualness of this, we'll let Mack start off.
Just sit there.
Just sit.
Okay.
Just sit.
Thanks.
Be relaxed.
Good morning. Let's see if I can beat the 5 minutes. As Brad mentioned, I'm Mack Paul, running for Senate District 18. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a Raleigh native, but my family really is from Eastern North Carolina, a very rural area. And growing up, for me, my grandmother had the biggest influence on my life. She was a pretty special person who raised 5 kids on a farm, and at an older age got a scholarship to go back to school and was able to get her college degree and ultimately her PhD, and became a college professor. And also a big activist, both in her community and also politically. So she influenced me a lot in terms of the role of education in your life, as well as the importance of giving back. So when my wife and I moved back to Raleigh in the early 90s, started getting involved in the community, like all of us here. But there have been a couple of times where I felt it was really important to step up and do something more. And one of those was, and for your benefit, we had a little bit of an issue in 2010, 2011 in Wake County with the school system, when a group got control of the school board and started to dismantle a lot of the policies that had made Wake County a strong system, one of the biggest in the country, which has its challenges as a growing community, but one that has always helped allow every child to have access to quality education, no matter what neighborhood they lived in. And so I was asked if I might take on the Democratic Party chairmanship at that time. And I did it with the condition that I could focus exclusively on this school board race in 2011. And we had to win all 5 seats in order to regain control. But we put together a coalition of people, and I was very sensitive and not wanting to make it more politicized than it already was, because these are nonpartisan seats. So we were more in the background, but putting together a group of diverse stakeholders, and we were able to win all of those races that year and get Wake County back on track. Now we have a different challenge this year, and it really caused me a lot of reflection after 2016 about what's going on here with this time of uncertainty. And the 2 things that became apparent to me: one, despite some of these economic improvements, low unemployment, there's tremendous anxiety out there. The middle class is continued to erode. We have the greatest wealth inequality, I think, in the history of our country. And it's just harder and harder for people to make ends meet with housing costs, education costs, healthcare costs going up. And that's fueling a lot of this uncertainty that we see. The other element is that it's clear our political process is broken. People feel like they don't have a voice. They have incredible frustration at both parties that they being able to really get anything done. And it's more a function of just where we are as a polarized society. So to address that, and the reason I'm running is, one, on the economic front, we really need to invest in education. And we clearly have fallen backwards overall as a state. We used to be a magnet for teachers to move here from Virginia, South Carolina, Tennessee. Now we're losing our best teachers. We're not paying them enough. We need more teaching assistants. We need more supplies. They're having to spend on average $500 a year out of their own pocket. But we also need to focus on early childhood, which we know has incredible return. As we saw with Smart Start, we have a big wait list with pre-K now. And training, I mean, we have a lot of great jobs that don't require a 4-year degree, and many, many people are not going to go on to get a 4-year degree. And we need to help break some of those barriers so they can fill jobs that pay $40,000 or $50,000 a year. But there are, again, difficulties in paying for those certifications in our community college system. On the political front, it's clear it took us a long time to get to where we are with this polarization. It's not going to change overnight. But one of the things that I think a number of us have pledged is an independent commission to draw districts that are much more reflective of our population. So rather than having our elected officials decide who our elected leaders are, we actually have a choice by having more balanced districts. Unfortunately, this district I'm running in is one of the few that is competitive, and we do have a chance this year, but we need to have all of them drawn in that fashion. The role of money in politics is way out of control. We need to do more with campaign finance, and also, and we'll talk a little bit about just having the ability to get access to the ballot for voters to be able to vote. So focusing on this broken political process and the fundamental economic challenges, the investment in education are my main focus. Thanks.
Right on time, Matt.
Greetings. My name is Brad Hessel, and I am also running for North Carolina Senate in District 18. And similar to Brad, the other Brad, I am also originally from the North, and although I moved down here in '92, so by this time I think it's fair to say that I am a Yankee by birth, but a Southerner by choice. I can actually use y'all properly in a sentence. So we moved down here with 3 school-age kids. Actually, one of them wasn't even school-age yet. They went through the Wake County public school system. We're very happy with our results, as all 3 of them are now off doing career stuff, and none of them are lazing around at home. So we're happy consumers of the public school system. My focus in running, I agree with a lot of what Mack said, in the sense that the atmosphere is so toxic now. When I was growing up, politicians, while they weren't revered, were definitely respected, and I think that a lot of that's been lost. So part of the motivation for me to run is to address that. My main issues are pretty standard. I'm focusing on education, on the economy, and on healthcare. And running as a libertarian, of course, I'm interested in affecting more choice in all of those arenas. But I really want to talk about, through this first session, in a little more detail about another issue that Matt mentioned, which is the redistricting situation here in North Carolina. What we have now is really not good for democracy in North Carolina, because as Mack mentioned, there's so many districts where it's one-sided. Now, even if we drew the districts correctly, there would be some districts that would be one-sided. You're not going to get competitive districts in every single one, but the districts now are artificially unbalanced. And so typically what happens in those unbalanced districts is only one party has a chance to win. And the only election that counts is the primary. And typically you get, what, 7% of the voters coming out for a primary. And of course, most of them are partisans. So well, you end up with somebody way to the right or way to the left elected. These guys get to Raleigh, and even if they wanted to compromise, which they probably usually don't, they would be afraid to, because if they were to do that, then they'd be vulnerable in the next primary to somebody that's even further or more extreme than they are. So it's a very dysfunctional system. I was reading the other day, and I don't remember if this was a Democrat or a Republican, but one of the reasons why this is such a bad situation is that it's actually technically worse now than it used to be, because the tools that are used to do the gerrymandering are so much more powerful in terms of the slicing and dicing. There was this instance where one incumbent had talked to the committee that was doing the drawing and had a line drawn such that there was a particular house that he had moved out of his district. The reason was because there was somebody living there whom he didn't want to run against. So it's not just that these guys are picking their voters, they're even picking their opponents. I mean, it's out of control. It's really beyond the pale. And I agree with what Mack suggested, that an independent commission that's not made up of legislators needs to be in charge of drawing these districts, and they need rules to draw them. In fact, maybe Joe can answer this question. I don't even understand exactly how this gerrymandering situation has come up, in the sense that in our Constitution, the North Carolina Constitution that is, it says that districts are supposed to be drawn according to geographic and political boundaries, and we're not doing that. So, I mean, you're serving, maybe you can explain how that happens. But this would be so easy to fix. Technically, I appreciate that politically it may not be so easy to fix, but I'm focusing on this issue in part because it does relate to the toxic atmosphere that I'm really concerned about, and also because I know that it doesn't poll well. It's not one of the top issues when you do the polling and ask voters what they care about. But I think it should be, because it's really something that would make a big impact. If we could fix this, it would help us a lot in North Carolina. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here this morning. Thank the organizers and sponsors of the event. I compliment you all for being interested enough and concerned enough about what is going on in your state government to take your time to be here and listen to these folks here in this event today. I'm Joe John, your representative in House District 40, which is Northwest Raleigh and Northwest Wake County. We have some cards over there on the table if you are interested as to whether your particular precinct, your particular residence is in House District 40. We've got a list on the back of the card of all the precincts and voting places in House District 40, so you can determine that very, very quickly, even before leaving here. My family and I live out in the Black Horse Run area off of Old Creedmoor Road. Lived there since the early 90s. Children have attended public schools in House District 40, Pleasant Union Elementary, and Leesville Road High School. In 2016, the voters of District 40 made me the first person in the history of our state to come to the General Assembly, the legislative branch of government, with substantial experience at the highest levels of both the judicial and executive branches of government, having previously served 25 plus years as a district court, superior court, court of appeals judge, and having worked several years as director of the state crime laboratory and previously as acting and deputy commissioner of DMV. That was some time ago now. Since coming to the General Assembly, and we, because of the wide variety of topics and subject matter that we encounter in the General Assembly, we tend to find ourselves focused on particular areas. And perhaps because of my former career as a North Carolina judge, much of my time over the past 2 years in the State House has been fighting what I call the war on an independent judiciary. I have stood against bill after bill, partisan elections, slashing seats on the Court of Appeals, elimination of judicial primaries, rigging judicial districts, constitutional amendments affecting the judiciary, and on and on and on, all calculated to bend North Carolina judges to the will of the supermajority. In my view, the worst of these are partisan elections for judges. We've gotten away from that for almost 20 years at various levels of our judiciary, and we've returned to that with my no vote this past year. The second bill I will introduce after being reelected in January will be to restore nonpartisan elections for North Carolina judges. And to me, it is wholly inconsistent to expect what we all think about for judges: independent, fair, impartial on the one hand, and to expect them to be partisan politicians on the other. That's wholly inconsistent, inappropriate, and improper in my view, and needs to be remedied sooner rather than later. Folks have touched on this issue on regarding other issues. The day I filed in 2016, I said, we must replace gerrymandering with a truly independent, impartial, nonpartisan legislative redistricting commission for congressional and state legislative districts, so that, as folks have said, voters will elect their representatives rather than politicians selecting their voters. By the way, the current districts weren't drawn last year when I was in the General Assembly. They were drawn back in 2010 when other folks were in the General Assembly. The first bill I introduced this past year in the House, in 2017, was to establish this commission. It died in committee, of course, but as long as I'm a North Carolina legislator, I'm going to continue to reintroduce it until it passes, although I may have to supplement it with a provision for an independent judicial districting commission sometime down the road. Of course, we also need to support our educational system from top to bottom as the bedrock of North Carolina's economy. And finally, fairness, non-discrimination, equal treatment in all matters across the board must be in the forefront of our thinking. Bill number 1, independent redistricting commission. Bill number 2, nonpartisan election of judges. Bills number 3, 4, and so forth probably will deal with education and other aspects of our life here in North Carolina. That is one of my major impressions after 2 years now in the North Carolina House, is the broad expanse of subject matter and topics we have to familiarize ourselves with and to be able to be in a position to cast at least a moderately informed vote. That's the approach I've taken. Same as I did when I was a judge. Just try to gather all the information that I can, weigh it out, listen to both sides, and then just do the best job I can in making a decision that's in the best interest of the taxpaying citizens of our state. You may not always agree with the decision I make, but you can know that I've thought it through and done my best to come to a fair and a reasonable decision. I'm not guided by any ideology. I take issue by issue and do my very best, as I said, to serve the interests of the taxpayers and citizens of North Carolina.
I'll have you wrap up, Joe.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Hi, I'm David Ulmer. I'm running for North Carolina House 40. I'm not sure how fairly I'll be treated. I'm a pretty hardcore Steelers fan, so you got your Bengals at 1 o'clock today.
They're all around me.
So, good. So a little bit about myself. I born in Jersey, grew up in Clearwater, Florida. Came to North Carolina through Wake Forest on an Army ROTC scholarship. Got to see Korea, most of Europe when I was in the service. Settled here in 1999 and got into information technology. It's a big industry in this area. Currently work as a contractor out at Cisco Systems. Wake Tech is where I actually got the degree that got me paid. Wake Tech does wonderful things. Community colleges do wonderful things for people. It is by far the best solution in this county for training people to just get jobs and go to work. My wife is a 2-year registered nurse from Wake Tech. And again, I can't say enough about having an educational system that focuses on putting people to work and putting them to work quickly in a way that they can profit, take care of their families. I contrast that now with my wife, who is getting a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing online, University of Wilmington. The issue I have there is, like a lot of people, she's trying to get ahead, but she's not a 19-year-old sophomore in college anymore. So she's having to take classes on theater, English literature, stuff that has nothing to do with her providing quality health care. And it's great that we can afford to put her through school right now. A lot of families, they can't. You know, if you're a single mother and you're trying to advance your career and get more money, you know, so you can take care of your family and make a mortgage, maybe you don't have time to pay $800 for a theater class. And these are the kind of things that we need to talk about when we talk about education. It's not as simple as we need more money. It's just not that simple. There's a lot of things that the state controls when it comes to schools that we really can't have. I mean, we have calendars. I mean, every year the school board has to go and try to adjust their calendar. They have to go to the North Carolina General Assembly. And of course, the fight becomes tourist towns on the Outer Banks versus Wake County. That doesn't require money to fix. Our local school board should control their calendars. They should control class size. They should take a lot more input from parents. And that budget should be a budget that is per student. And they should have more flexibility. I mean, a former CFO at Food Lion went to work in one of the public county schools, and part of the budget issue is the allotments. There's so many buckets of money that can always be spent on one thing or the other. If you had a simple model where you're funding that child at $9,000 or $10,000 a student, and you give the local school board the flexibility to focus on educating the child and taking that input from local parents, you'll end up with a better school system. You can also do things like fund students. You know, I mean, you want equity, you want a better school system, fine. Fund more money for children from low-income housing or that need special needs. But you talk to teachers, it's not just the money. There's a respect issue too. These individualized learning plans, again, another great state idea. But some teachers struggle with 10 of them for 20 student classrooms. The paperwork and the bureaucracy that a lot of teachers are struggling with in their classroom, again, has nothing to do with money. We have a lot of great teachers in Wake County, and a lot of parents are very happy with their school system and with their teachers. But those teachers are struggling not just because of money, but because of the bureaucracy that we force down their throats. So I think when we talk about schools, we need to kind of step away from that simple solution that we'll just pay more money and it'll be better. You know, I have a car outside. You could offer me $8 grand for it. You could offer me $10 grand for it. You get the same car. If you don't make some changes into how you approach education, we're not going to make it better. So that would be my #1 focus, and it's a devil in the details type thing, but we need to get there. Other things that I'm concerned about, I'll say this, I'm a little more positive in some ways. I know a lot of people talk about polarization and they're very, you know, disappointed with the tone in politics. I will tell you, for some younger voters, I'm encouraged. And one of the reasons I'm encouraged is they're starting to see that maybe the federal government or a big state program isn't the solution to every problem. That there's a lot of things that sometimes government does that isn't right or isn't the best. You know, we talk about making our medical system better. We have certificate of need laws in the state that basically stifle competition. Right now, there's a Dr. Singh in Winston-Salem who's suing the state of North Carolina. He's a doctor. He's a licensed doctor in North Carolina. He wants to have an MRI machine. But of course, the big hospital networks who donate to the big political parties don't want that competition. So he could offer MRIs at half the cost in Winston-Salem. But the state of North Carolina decided he doesn't have that right. So now he has to go fight in the courts for that basic right. You know, I had Mack Paul is familiar with zoning here in the city of Raleigh. And I was at an event at Northwest CAC, and they, you know, one of the local assisted living facilities was trying to, you know, rezone some land on an adjacent property for parking. But they joked because one of the reasons is they're expanding their facility from, they have 134 beds now. They just want to have more private rooms. A lot of their rooms are double beds. And they said, will you be adding more beds? And the lady from the facility basically joked, it takes 5 years to add beds in North Carolina. So we have this rising demand where seniors like my parents need help. They need assisted living. Costs keep rising. but we have a certificate of need system that makes it almost impossible to add beds in a timely fashion. Again, when you make it hard to change, when you make it hard to provide care to people through regulation, which was at one point intended to do good, you do a lot of damage. That drives up costs. That's cost that my family bears, and these are the things that motivate me to run. You know, I mean, look, I see it with my wife in the education system, as I pointed out. I see it with my parents and the costs. We do things to people with the best of intentions, but the end result is regulatory capture. You have special interests that see the government is controlling and regulating these things, and we end up with a situation where we're not really free to take care of ourselves. We can't take care of our loved ones because government has decided how we're going to do that. And that is my motivation for who I am. So appreciate you listening to me. Hope you consider voting for me. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having us this morning. We really appreciate the opportunity to get out and speak to you. My name is Marilyn, Avila, and I'm not a stranger to this game. I ran for office in House District 41st in 2006 and served 5 terms after that. And I know the process intimately, and the shortcomings and the good things about it as well. Myself, personally, I approach my job as a legislator because of 2 factors. One is how I was brought up. I was raised on a farm in Southeast Georgia. And when you're a farmer's daughter, you learn what you can have and not a whole lot of what you won't, because you have to prioritize when the money comes in once a year, and it has to be budgeted quite well. The second factor that affected how I approach my life as a legislator, is my formal college training as a chemist, when I trained on the scientific method. And that means simply that I make my decisions based on facts. And a lot of times you don't like the facts you get. And too many times, because of that, in politics, we try to make things work that aren't, because they don't follow the facts. So I analyze very carefully in 3 areas. I talk to the people who are for something, I talk to people who are against it, and I also try to find, if at all possible, any type of objective data that nobody has a special interest, they've got the facts. And that has served me well in a lot of areas in making decisions. It makes it a lot easier when you are solid in your facts. Although I will admit, when you get ready to punch the button, and in North Carolina they give you a green one for yes and a red one for no, there is no, I can't make up my mind, I'll just be present kind of attitude here. You always ask yourself, did I ask all the questions, and did I get all the answers that I need? And it's a scary job, for sure, to be in that, have that responsibility in people's lives. You've heard a lot of talk about education, and education is important when it comes to me in the legislature taking positions on making the system work. I got an inside view with a daughter who's a former school teacher, and learned up close and personal some of the issues that are wrong with it and some of the things that are good with it. But what happened in my journey in the General Assembly was an interest that developed in health and human services. I was first interested in what was happening in our mental health system in North Carolina. Back in the early 2000s, we had a wonderful idea that it was not in the best interest of people to institutionalize them in large psychiatric hospitals, that if we gave them the freedom to go back to their community and be with support groups, they would be much better off. Again, a political good intention, bad implementation, because they didn't check back home what was available. And we've been playing catch up for the past 20 or 30 years, establishing effective programs and access that our people need. And what happens in education, because it's such a concentrated population, it's in public education, community college, and universities, it gets a lot of press. You don't hear about a lot of HHS issues until something horrible goes wrong. You don't hear them fighting for more money over here to do this or more money over here to do that, because it's such a diverse population. I have Alzheimer's patients. I have developmentally disabled. I have the mental health patients. I have foster children. I have TBI patients, traumatic brain injury. I have the people living in assisted living homes. All of those subgroups make up HHS, which is where my interest is. Some of the things I've done for years, when I first started in the General Assembly in the minority, I was put on the Juvenile Justice Committee and became familiar with the problem in North Carolina called Raise the Age. We were putting 16 and 17-year-old children in the adult justice system. We along with New York rather, were the only two states that were still doing that. And we fought to get that changed. Unfortunately, I was not in the General Assembly when it did get changed, but I'm very proud of the work that I did in helping educate people that it was something North Carolina needed to do. However, it's a shame we were the last state to do it. But that's politics sometimes.
I'll have you wrap up, Marilyn.
One of the other things that was very important to me was a bill that I helped get passed called the Avila Act. I faced so many parents who had children that they were taken care of, and they were fearing what was going to happen to that child when they were no longer around. And we were able to get a piece of legislation through where they could set up savings accounts and be able to put away money and not lose the benefits that were available to them through any government programs. I really would like to get to know you better, explain more of what I've done, and would appreciate your vote. Thank you.
All right, as we continue in casual, I'll throw out, I want to make sure that your questions get answered because I know the traffic problem that starts at noon. So we'll try and get through it. I think a lot of people have been, thank you, sir. I think a lot of people have been interested in the amendment situation. Are the amendments what will bring you to the polls? Do you know what the amendments are? And you're dealing with 6 amendments and people will say, yeah, it may bring me to the polls, but I'm not quite sure what I'm dealing with. So I will take whomever would like to answer the first. Brad would like to take it first on what the amendment situation is, where you stand, and we'll try and move through if there are people who have answers that they would like to share.
My position on the constitutional amendments is generally pretty unenthusiastic, I would say. Let's see, we have the amendment for the voter suppression amendment where they want voter ID, completely unnecessary. There's never been any evidence of any voter fraud. The government should be making it easier to vote, not harder to vote. So I'm totally against that. Marcy's Law, which is for the rights of victims of crimes. I like some of the concepts behind Marcy's Law. I have some concerns about the potential costs attendant to some of the specific measures that they're talking about. But in any event, it's Marcy's Law, not Marcy's constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment is totally an inappropriate way to put this in effect. So I'm definitely against that one as well. The judicial appointments is simply a power grab by the legislature, which would be pull things out of whack in North Carolina in terms of the balance of power between the different branches of government. So I'm against that. The Board of Election change, where the legislature wants to appoint those folks as well. That one is similarly just a power grab, and also has a particularly pernicious element in it, in the sense that there are, let's see, 100 counties in North Carolina. Each one has a Board of Elections consisting of 4 people, and then there's the State Board of Elections, which has 9 people on it. Independent voters in North Carolina have just become the 2nd largest group. In 2017, the number of independent voters in North Carolina surpassed the number of Republican voters in North Carolina for the first time ever in the history of the state. They amount to about 30% of the voters, 2.1 million compared to 2 million of the Republicans, 2.7 million of the Democrats approximately. So there are 100 counties times 4 people on each Board of Election, and then 9 for the states. That's 409 total people on the boards of election. I just told you that there are 30% of the voters are independent. How many independent voters do you imagine are on the boards of elections? You'd be wrong. There is one. There is one independent voter on the state board of elections, which consists of 9 total people now. And the constitutional amendment under question would reduce the number of people on the state board elections to 8, and of course eliminate that position for an independent voter. So there would once again be 0. So that we need to come up with the boards of election are important. They decide when the vote, when the voting will occur in terms of hours and the sites. Of course, these are important questions. Independent voters should have a voice in making those decisions. Let's see, what did I leave out? Oh, the one that I like, the tax rate amendment. I am in favor of that. The tax rate currently in North Carolina is 5%. So we're talking about reducing the cap on the rate from 10% to 7.5%. It will have 0 effect on revenues at this point in time. And of course, I am in favor of lower taxes generally. So I'm okay with that particular amendment, but the other 5, I'm opposed to.
Anybody else? Matt?
I would just say, at a high level, my biggest problem with the constitutional amendments is the intentionality behind them, and I think it reflects where we are in North Carolina with the supermajority, which is essentially a majority in our General Assembly making decisions without any public input or compromise. And so these, as Brad said, either have 2 motives. One is to just draw more voters out for political gain without a lot of foresight and detail about how they would be implemented, or 2 of them are to simply take power away from our governor just because the governor happens to be on the other side of the aisle, which is very short-sighted, I think, for our state to be amending the Constitution. Yeah, there's some that, I mean, I think Marcy's Law was a bill that passed in the House, not in the Senate. Why can't we, and I think has a lot of good elements to it. Why can't we pass it instead of put it in our Constitution? And then I would just say on the income tax, I do have some concern about artificially setting a ceiling when the state has to balance the budget, and we may find ourselves in difficult times, 3-5 years down the road, and having to raise property tax or sales tax or other more regressive forms of taxation. We all want taxes to be as low as possible, but I'm concerned about setting artificial limits in the Constitution. So again, I mean, I think one reason so many people want to break the supermajority is so that we don't have to contend with things like this that are pretty dramatic changes to our Constitution that have purely a political aspect behind them.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention hunting and fishing. I'm opposed to that. It's completely yet unnecessary.
Just a couple of comments. I'm trying not to repeat what other folks have said. A couple of things you may not know about the constitutional amendments. It's already been suggested, with the exception of Marcy's Law, they were pretty much rammed through by the supermajority, without discussion, without much opportunity to have input, or certainly to amend. The main concern about 5 of the 6 constitutional amendments is that as we sit here today, none of us knows exactly what these constitutional amendments are going to effect. That is because the General Assembly, over the no vote of many, failed to include what is called enabling legislation. That is, very simply, how it's going to work. The Hunt and Fish Amendment, for example, it says we're going to establish a constitutional right to hunt and fish. That sounds okay, but we don't know what that means. Does that mean all the time, anywhere, never, nowhere, always on Sunday, never on Sunday, with a license, without a license? We don't know. I don't know. No one can tell you right now as we sit here today what it means. It will be, if it passes, determined perhaps in the November 27th session, when the General Assembly will come back and look at whichever of the constitutional amendments pass and say, oh, okay, here's what it means. Not what you thought when you voted back on November 6th, but here's what we say it means now, after the fact. That's a serious, serious concern, and in my view, a valid reason to reject constitutional amendments. It's photo ID, by the way, is the another amendment. What kind of photo ID will be accepted? We don't know. Driver's license, real ID that you've got to wait 5 or 6 hours in line for, maybe. Driver's license, perhaps. College ID, I doubt in the current constitution of the General Assembly that would pass. But we don't know. And why are we embedding photo ID in the Constitution of the state of North Carolina when, if not today, in a very short period of time, we will have retinal ID, digital ID, voice ID, and facial recognition? Photo ID will be at best one of the least reliable means of identification, yet we will have embedded it in the Constitution of the state of North Carolina. Just a couple of observations. Thank you.
And that's kind of how government works, it seems, these days. I'll talk about children real quick. Photo ID. I do think if we talk about polarization and working with others, we should acknowledge that it will probably pass. Right now, the way the polling is showing, a significant majority of people do have concerns around the integrity of elections. I oppose the voter ID. I'm also very concerned that once it passes, they'll skip back into session and write that real quick before any changes to the makeup of the General Assembly actually get to be involved. But I just encourage people to think about what you think would be the compromise. I mean, if you're worried about disenfranchising people who are perhaps older and no longer have birth certificates and stuff, maybe you make the exception, no photo ID for anybody over 55 or who appears to be or claims to be over 55. You will have to pay, I mean, because that's one of the groups that claims, is there's a concern for is people who are much older and don't have, valid photo IDs. I mean, most people under 40 these days do, and I think student ID should be acceptable. But I encourage people, as they know, yes, on every issue, you want to change that tone in the polarization. Consider that something's coming, and think what you would give the other side that would make that fair, or at least more reasonable. Because just saying no is that's how you got where you are now, folks. Yes and no on every issue. So you kind of have to, on your own, this is on the voters. You keep electing people based on yes and no, and then you wonder why your General Assembly is malfunctioning. It's kind of on y'all. You do it to yourselves in many cases. With the tax cap, look, if you went from where we are now up to 7%, that would still be a third of, it'd be a 30% plus tax rate. I hope to think that whatever little misfortune has happened, a 1/3 tax rate rise would cover it. If not, I don't know what to tell you. I think it's very fair. The more money you let somebody keep, the more successful they are in taking care of their own family. So.
Thank you. I would have a couple of comments on several of them. The photo ID, voter fraud does exist, pure and simple. The reason we don't know it's there is because we don't look for it. Everybody says they don't come to you and they're not who they say they are. I've worked the polls, and I've had people come to me and hand me a name and address, and that ain't who they are. Because I can look at the age also and know that the 45-year-old woman standing in front of me is not the 75-year-old woman she claims to be. Okay? So, that aside, how it's going to be done, it will be fought out. But voter fraud does exist, has existed, and probably always will exist under any kind of form we put up. And the more we try to control it and prevent it, the better. Because any vote that is cast illegally is robbing you of your voice. Marty's Law is already in the Constitution. It already says in there the victim's rights as prescribed by law. What that means is the laws that cover what a victim is entitled to and can receive under the law can change from session to session to session. All we're saying is we want as much formality and consistency for the victim as we have the rights of the perpetrator. And theirs is laid out quite well too. Hunting and fishing, the reason there is because of what happens in a lot of areas, what we're running into here in Wake County. We're losing a lot of land. We're losing the opportunity for people to have access to have hunting and fishing rights. 21 states, 28 states, I think it is, have this in their constitution. It's one of those things you need to study, do some research on of who passed it, why they passed it, what's it done. And tax caps, a tax cap's kind of like a closet. As big as you build it, you'll fill it. So keeping it low is not going to hurt. I'm in favor of doing that. And I agree totally with David that with the kind of tax increase that would come up to 7% from where we're keeping our taxes right now is manageable in terms of taking care of the cost of government for the state of North Carolina.
All right. As you can see, as we pass down, we're going to run out of time very quickly. I'll throw out a couple of things, but I want your questions. So I'll throw out a couple of things. We're now at upwards of $21 trillion in debt. $100 billion a year more than it brings in. We have tax cuts that have created a great economy. Are you in favor of those, dealing with that? We have Judge Kavanaugh questions as to how that was handled, how we handled that forward. We have the way that Donald Trump is dealing with tariffs right now with China that is going to affect North Carolina in a great way. Do you support those? Those are potentials. I'm not going to throw them out because we're down to about a half an hour and we can move through very quickly. If somebody have a specific question that they would like, I will bring this over to you then, my friend. And I will let you ask.
Oh my God, it's truly.
Education was very important. I didn't get the education.
Right up to your mouth.
I didn't get the educational background like all of you. I presuppose you're a lawyer. You went to law school? Okay. The gentleman told us he was educated at Wake Tech.
And Wake Forest.
And
I have a Bachelor of the Arts in Wake
I would
Forest
like
University.
to know when you want to, what is your major, what's your degree in it, and yeah, and then what's we know some of your work background, but I would like to have it.
You want education background from everybody?
Educational and work background.
Education work background, if we can go through very quickly. I'll pass. Mack, you get started.
I know your grandmother, but not yours.
Yes, sorry, I did mention my grandmother.
And we'll go quickly on this.
Yeah, real quick. I went to Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, undergrad, history major. Went to work. I got a fellowship to go work in Africa on an education project and got enrolled in a PhD program at University of Southern California. After college, just finished the master's and decided to go to law school instead of completing that. But I worked in, my education degree was basically how to invest in educational systems for economic development and the best return on investment. And then went to Columbia Law School and came back to Raleigh in the early 90s, focused on, I started out in litigation, which I did not like at all, but have evolved into real estate practice and land use and do a lot of work in the development community. And my passion is infrastructure and what makes cities great places and from a work standpoint.
Thank you, Brett.
I was born in Manhattan, grew up in Westchester County, which is just north of New York City. Went to public school there. Went to public school there through 10th grade. My parents decided I was not performing up to my level, and so I ended up my last couple of years of high school at Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, and then went to Brown University where I got a degree in history, and came back to New York and got involved in the publishing industry. Then a company that I was working for, or that I co-founded actually, moved down here to Cary in '92, and that's how I got down to North Carolina. By that time, I was involved in technical writing and training, and I kind of parlayed that into knowledge management. And since '99, I've had my own knowledge management practice. Knowledge organizations to collect, organize, and distribute information in ways that help them run business. So, just a quick example that, sales reps are the sales reps all over the world. You want them to have not only information on your products, but also on the energy products, competitor products. So that when you do the process, they will decide to and see if they're reliable, they are, whether the objectives can be, whatever. That's just one example of how you can use out. That's two ways, right? You can see what the travel bill, since I've also spent a year on Fulbright, French government, around the 17 since leaving Chicago, I have worked as a legal aid, the prosecutor, litigation, a small law firm, and on the application for which on that prosecutors, they have their information, their work with the legal public vehicles in the state, that work with the arbitrator, so thank you. Yes, like I said, we wait for the university. I mean, Army Army DC Partnership. I got a bachelor in the arts. Spent 4.5 years left the Army really running Catholic. Also then moved to Wade Tech when I got back to Wade County and I left the service and came here. I was all communications degree there and got into information technology. I worked with a lot of products and systems. That also along with my Army background allowed me to do a lot of work with the Department of Defense. So I've been to Japan and Hawaii, but I've also been to Afghanistan and Iraq. I've been actually I'm sort of people teenage parties and stuff, and also back to Afghanistan. That's a multi-generational war voice. Grand babies on the way, so in 20, 38, anyway, that's my work background involved in paramount travel and while we're doing as I stated earlier, the current environment is established and sort of work with the university at the criminal chemistry. You actually started the work at that time I was in and see the new thing on the private. And after college, I went to work for the textile company and worked with that time. I met him in college. He's the regional teacher. He was naturalized American citizen now. And graduated and he was accepted the job at Eastern Salem. And he moved to North Carolina and started work. And he was to me as commission and writing the things we were as black development constantly. And then I read this morning on the veterinarian temporarily at the shop. So it was really to Raleigh. Hairstyling salons for a number of years here. And after we got out of those businesses, I worked for the John Locke Foundation as administrator and finance manager for 16 years before I was elected to office and spent 10 years in the General Assembly.
Anybody have anything specific that they would like? Wow. We've covered it all? Yes, ma'am.
I'm really concerned about, well, all the amendments, but the voter ID amendment, because when the legislature tried to pass it before, they made it so restrictive that it was struck down. And I guess I don't trust if it passed what voter IDs, they're not saying what voter IDs they would require. They would, the previous one would have made it hard for students to use their ID. It's hard for elderly people to get a driver's license. I just don't trust the amendment's too broad. It doesn't say what type of ID is going to be required. And so I really hope people vote against it.
But we're seeing polling, as you said, David, that voter ID may potentially pass at this point?
Yes.
Because people don't understand it.
Now, I'll just again point out the downside is the people in front, regardless of who you vote for, the General Assembly will likely come back in session and they'll write that before the new team gets in place. So I can share an opinion, but even if I'm elected, I probably won't be the one that writes or participates in voting for or against that.
And understand, it's the General Assembly, even if the blue wave and blue tsunami or whatever came through and every current supermajority representative was voted out of office, it still would be those individuals who would decide what voter ID or photo ID meant.
And I'm actually voting in favor of it because, like I said, I've worked and there were people who walked up to me and told me who they were and I knew they weren't. There are a number of states who have passed the Supreme Court decision of whether or not you should have voter ID. And my hope and prayer is, and influence of whatever it may be and wherever it may be, would be that our General Assembly would follow closely with what those states have found to be effective to give the most people the opportunity to get the identification necessary for them to vote.
I think it would have been helpful if they described that in the amendment. Are they going to let students use their ID? Are they going to give some other way for elderly people who don't have driver IDs?
Now we open the floodgates.
She's first, so I have to walk back.
First, we all just done.
Yeah.
I just have a quick process question as to what determines that, because you were commenting that there's this the voter ID and then it went to the assembly, but then it came down, so now it's going as an amendment. So what qualifies something as first going as a bill versus coming forward as an amendment? How does that differ in the process so the voters can understand where they think something should belong?
So who wants to take first?
I think it'd be that quick. We're confusing two different things. There was an original bill which was passed, which to make a long story short, the courts found very restrictive and indeed constitutionally infirm and threw it out. And so now that it has come back and is being resurrected without any details, as we've already talked about, as this potential constitutional amendment.
Why wouldn't it go through the original process that it went through the first time of becoming a bill and going forward?
It has to. It's called enabling legislation. Legislation is going to have to be passed in order for this amendment to be effective.
But you will vote without knowing what that enabling legislation may be in the future.
How is it determined whether something's a law or an amendment?
Yeah, I think just to elaborate a little bit, to be a constitutional amendment, it has to go on the ballot and have a majority of the voters vote on it versus legislation which is approved or enacted by the General Assembly with a majority vote. And so these could all be in the form of a bill. Some of them have been, like the voter ID, which was struck down, as the court found it certain, penalizing African Americans with surgical precision. There's obviously was an intent behind the goal there, but that's basically the difference between the two.
Yes, Deborah.
I was going to say, isn't also the difference that if it's embedded in the Constitution, then a law has to pass a constitutional test. But if it's embedded in the Constitution, then the law would automatically pass the constitutional test. If the Constitution simply says if you have to have a voter ID, then any law that's passed would pass that constitutional test. So it couldn't be struck down by the courts. Isn't that the purpose of having something?
It's just that simple, Deborah. Yes, Mary.
Again, on the voter ID issue, I was going to ask Marilyn Avila about how come the absentee ballots, which are much more likely to have some kind of problem, are not included. How come there was a 59-page law that struck down? I've been outside of polling places where many people have come over to me because they can't vote, because they moved before, or they didn't have their information, or there was something because they had moved out of the district. Perfectly eligible voters who are likely to be disenfranchised in the tens of thousands. And that is a real danger with this amendment. the legislature actually passed, does everything, this legislature in my mind, does everything possible to make it harder to vote. I mean, do you know that our local libraries are not allowed to register voters by law, by the legislation? That's the kind of legislation that we can expect to see come down if this amendment passes.
Yes, I bypassed you, forgive me.
Continue on with the voter registration. I think it's the unknown in all of these amendments that's the most frightening. You know, you put a title on, this is it, and here we are talking about all the problems that exist underneath. And that's the frightening thing, and I'll give you just one example. My son just received his driver's license. He moved here 3 years ago. He's not a child. When he was issued the license, they didn't take a new photo of him. They used an old photo, which is now 20 years old, gave him a new one on the picture and that. How valid is that? And that's just one simple example of what goes on underneath that frightens me. We don't know.
I'm just going to retort with a quick question.
Sure.
If you don't trust government and what they're doing and the politicians you elect, why do you continue to give them so much power as voters? You basically are putting people in power and giving government more power, and then when it doesn't work, you seem surprised, where they have a good track record of failing us.
This is why we are here and so many people are sitting at home.
Well, there's only one party fully committed to really reducing the power and strength of government to have control of your life. So I'll close with that.
Coming around to you.
I'd like to change the topic. And with the federal government trying to reduce the rules that relate to air pollution and other kinds of environmental regulations and turn some of this back to the state, what are each of your positions on the environment, clean air and water, as well as clean energy versus fossil fuel development?
We're going right down the line again. All right, remember, let's see if we can do this to 90 seconds. So
Very proud to have the endorsement of the Sierra Club and League of Conservation Voters. Environmental issues are a high priority for me. And it's overshadowed a little bit right now with some of the other issues that are going on, but we see the report came out last week on some of the impending threats with climate change. North Carolina has been a leader in shifting to renewable energy. We've unfortunately rolled back a lot of the incentives for solar. We're like the second producer of solar power in the country after California. So there's a lot we can do at the state level to both like oppose offshore drilling, encourage more renewable energy, and also in this district that we're in, water is a huge issue, Falls Lake watershed, and we need to make sure we protect that and give the resources that we've unfortunately cut to our Division of Environmental Quality to test our water. We've had the Gen X pollution that we've seen dumped into the Cape Fear River. So there's a lot more North Carolina needs to do. Thank you for asking that question.
When we first set up government here in the United States, the purpose of government basically was to provide for the common defense, to make sure that there was a stable currency so we could all conduct business back and forth, and to protect individual rights. Now, the government does 9 million other things. It doesn't do any of those original 3 things all that well, unless you think policing the world is a good idea for us, which I know. And generally speaking, I think that your question falls into this general category, as David has mentioned, of what are we asking government to do? When you try to regulate this with respect to regulations, to control this with using regulations, the problem basically is that large, well-heeled organizations who are not even necessarily evil, but they got to try to influence the outcome. If they aren't at the table trying to make sure that the regulations come out in a way that doesn't hurt their business, their competitors are going to be there. So you're basically setting up a situation that's ripe for corruption and essentially creating a one-stop shop with the federal government having all this power where any large organization can go. I mean, you saw this with Microsoft. I'm not a big fan of Microsoft, but Microsoft was singular in not doing any lobbying, and then they got hit by a ton of government regulation that cost them billions and billions of dollars, and now, of course, they have lobbyists, and because they saw that they had to do that. So a better way forward would be in the case of pollution. Why is Duke Energy does everything that the regulations say, which they help write, and so now they're immune from any responsibility for these problems. And the same thing with the pork farmers and the spills, because if they followed all the regulations and still bad things happen, so it's not their fault. It would be better if those folks were held responsible for whatever damage was caused. And I'm not even talking about corporations, but the people that make those decisions should be held responsible for the effects of anything that happens that hurts somebody else. So that's the direction I would go in.
Duke Energy is held harmless for the damage it caused because the supermajority in the General Assembly allows them to be held harmless by their votes. Absolutely nothing more critical, nothing more important than clean air and clean water. We've got to strike a reasonable balance between regulation and protection. There's got to be a middle ground. We can't over-regulate. I don't disagree with folks who say that. Nothing drives me crazy that have to deal with bureaucracies, be it on day-to-day level, the telephone company or Time Warner, whoever it might be. But we've got to protect water and air. We can't subsist. We cannot exist without clean air and clean water. I've got the same endorsements that Mack has from environmental groups. I'm proud of them. Thank you.
Real quick, going back to some things we talked about, I trust y'all. I trust y'all in a jury. So if a hog farm gets sued by a neighbor because their property has been turned into an open air sewer, if you don't limit the damages, that hog farm will go out of business. It will vanish. And the other hog farmers in other parts of the state will take a look at that and go, huh, I'm gonna stay in business and keep raising hogs. I should probably comply with some common sense environmental laws. You don't have to be too involved. Because again, I would trust you guys in the jury box far more than the people in the North Carolina General Assembly. If you talk about climate change, we have a national flood insurance program that pays people to rebuild their homes after they get flooded out. Multiple times. There are people that live along the Mississippi that the government's come in and rebuilt their flooded home over and over. If you were to deregulate the insurance markets, guess what? Some places in the Outer Banks, you couldn't afford to build there because nobody can pay for $7,000 a month insurance. So that's where deregulation does work real quick. You want to build there, self-insure or don't insure, or find a place that isn't going to flood, because the insurance companies will use accurate climate science data. Regardless of what the General Assembly says is or is not good data for climate science, people with money on the line, i.e. insurance companies, they will use the best science available. Thank you.
And he's moved into my area, and I get very basic and detailed. Is when the regulations get proposed, it's based on some kind of data. And way too often you have data that is emotionally driven and you have data that's scientifically driven. And the question is which and which is going to win. And generally the one that's going to return an investment to some guy that's going to put his money in it is going to win. We've seen that in some of the direction we've taken with alternative energies, the way we've moved way too fast in solar energy before we had the ability to store it. There have been billions and billions of dollars worth of solar energy wasted that you paid for, and a lot of other people have paid for, simply because we jumped the gun and didn't have the ability to use it by storing it before we went out and built solar panels all over the country and on everybody's roof. So the basics is where you have to start, and that is making sure that you've got the data of what is the effect of whatever you're talking about, whether it's solar energy, whether it's ocean rising or anything of that nature. You have got to be honest and you've got to be fair in the fact that you get your facts and you use them, whether you like the answer or not. But that's not what drives a lot of it. It is, unfortunately, as a gentleman at this table has said a number of times, there's a dollar bill that enters into this discussion and unfortunately drives too much of what happens.
All right, we are probably at that moment, right, Deborah?
Yeah.
You want to wrap her up?
Sure.
And
Hi, first I want to say thank you, Brad, very much for moderating. And to all the candidates, thank you very much. I'm just going to say we're sort of here until noon. As many of you know, our religious school gets out at noon, and also the church down the block gets out at noon. So there are definitely some carpool, getting stuck in the parking lot issues. You're welcome to stay for a little longer and talk with the candidates or talk among yourselves, grab a little something else to eat if you want to, just bearing in mind that at noon school does get out. You can already see the line of cars sort of getting into the carpool line, and the church does get out at the same time. So we just don't want you to get stuck. I want to thank also the Adult Education Committee for organizing this this forum.
Early voting starts Wednesday.
I'm sorry, what?
Early voting Wednesday.
Oh, early voting starts Wednesday. Vote, 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 vote. As I said in shul yesterday, I'd be happy to tell you how to vote, but just vote. Thank you. Thank you all very much.